it as well. So over to you, Eva.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. We definitely appreciate comments. We were just talking that we have been working on this for a little bit and would like to kind of finish the main analyses and figure out our approach over the summer as our semesters are wrapping up. So any feedback would be greatly appreciated. It actually started as an undergraduate thesis of one of my students, Grace, who has since gone to the real job world. And we've decided to take it further because nobody has looked at it in a while and kind of progress. But we also are dealing with a policy that has staggered timing, but there are multiple policies. So we can't really use any of the new methods. So that's why we would love to get some feedback from you guys. What do you think is the best way to sort of package this, approach it? So please share any and all feedback that you might have. Okay, so the motivation for this is that there has been a few changes in the policies, and sort of in the 90s when the movement began to increase enforcement. Part of that package was barring students who were not documented and didn't have legal permanent residency in the US to attend post-secondary education. And part of this was that we couldn't offer them the same tuition benefits if not all US citizens could get them as well. So that was sort of a federal change that happened. But at the same time, when you look at the evidence, the students or undocumented youth who are in the US are not very likely to return to their countries of origin, even with sort of the limited possibilities in regards to staying in the US and limited access to the formal labor market. There is some evidence that they do better if they have higher education, they have higher paying jobs. And in the early 2000s, states have started passing legislations on their own, sort of circumventing the federal piece, where they did allow their students who proved residency for a particular number of years, it varies by state, to actually access the in-state tuition benefits. And some went actually even further, extending access to financial aid, and some states went the opposite direction, making it even more difficult in terms of documentation and proof of residency to get the cheaper tuition. So this is kind of an overview of the positive policy. So the access, the darker colors are the states who now offer both in-state tuition and access to financial aid. The lighter gray colors are the states that only offer in-state tuition rates. So it is not kind of concentrated to one part of the country or another. This is sort of the timeline of things, and this table shows you all three policies that are used in our analysis. So whether or not state offers the access to cheaper tuition, whether or not you have access to also financial aid, they do roll out at different times for most of the states. And we do also, based on some previous literature, now incorporate policies that are actually restrictive, so that make it more difficult to attend college at that rate. So the existing research and kind of the reason why we decided to revisit this topic. The results are pretty mixed. There is nothing kind of definitive. The early results looked at sort of short-term impacts, used mostly the CPS at the beginning, and they used the ethnicity proxy, so Hispanic non-citizens, to try to identify the undocumented youth. There were some positive effects, some studies that found no effects. The 2016 study in the IMR actually showed no effects, and they're the ones that pushed for introducing the hostile policies into the analysis as well, that we can't only look at policies that are positive, but that you have to account sort of for the restrictive pieces as well. So we're kind of building on that one, adding the restrictive policies. They also, in their study, added both kind of positive and negative policies towards undocumented that were not related to higher education. So we call them sort of social and anti-social policies. So that would be access to healthcare and other state benefits that they might offer as kind of a control for general environment for the undocumented in the state. And they all, up to that point, use the ethnicity proxy. A more recent paper in 2020 actually used both the ethnicity proxy and they also used the residual method. So kind of over the ethnicity, also removing anyone who holds a job that likely requires permanent residency. So not just looking at non-citizens who are Hispanic, but also, right, if you work for the post office, you have to have legal residency, so they probably are not undocumented. So it's just kind of a more refined measure of trying to identify the undocumented population in the data. So throughout this kind of past 15 years or so, there's been a variety of studies using mostly CPS, and kind of mixed results, I guess, at best. So what do we focus on? We do focus on enrollment, and we actually look at two measures of enrollment. So whether or not you're currently attending school at the time of the survey, but at the same time, if you're trying to take a class and then you give up, or you have taken 2 semesters and you quit, we would not pick you up with the current kind of contemporary measures. So we also create a measure of, have you ever taken a college class? So they ask if you've completed any college classes. So we look at it from 2 dimensions: currently being in class, and have you ever attempted to take a class? So have you ever taken a course in college? We do try to extend on the existing literature by looking at graduation. So most of the this population would be attending community colleges. So we look at associate's degree, so 2-year college degree from a community college. So that is sort of an addition that not all of the previous literature has had the ability to look at with sort of the timing. And we also add by examining labor market effects. So we are looking whether or not if it affects employment or participation in the labor force among this population. So in terms of our contributions, we feel that none of the papers actually that I've mentioned had examined these effects separately by gender. So we look at them by women and men. And not only that, we actually take that a little bit further and take a look deeper by marital status and look at a bit of a intra-household dynamics as well. We do add the labor market outcomes and allow for that graduation or completion of the 2-year degree as well. We are able to add more states and take our data up to 2020. We did not want to kind of introduce the whole COVID thing, so that's where we stop in 2019. We are examining multiple education policies, so not only access to the in-state tuition, but also financial aid, and really capturing the hostile policies as well, and controlling for state level overall policies towards the undocumented. We are expanding beyond the Mexican classification that most of the literature had used in the past, though they are a large fraction of our sample, and we do also estimate for robustness separately just for the sample on Mexico. And we do believe that refining the ethnicity proxy identification of the undocumented by removing the likely authorized types of population and jobs and occupations creates a more refined and precise measure of capturing the undocumented in the data. So we do use the American Community Survey from 2000 up to 2019. We start with the ethnicity proxy and then remove the likely authorized occupations. We do get data for the state level policies from the Higher Ed Immigration Portal and kind of double check through several sources. We also include the actual cost of attendance in public 2-year institutions. So we merge in the tuition data and measure what is the impact, kind of the penalty of the out-of-state tuition. So we have a measure of the actual increase in cost. we capture unemployment rate to control for the state level environment as well. As I mentioned, we look at both access to in-state tuition and financial aid, and then also the hostile policies. And these are the 5 outcomes: currently in college, ever have taken a college class, graduated with the AA degree, currently employed, and not in the labor force. So in the sample, we identify what we think are the most likely undocumented immigrants. We restrict the ages to 18 to 22 for the current enrollment and labor force participation. For graduation rates, we give the sample some time to actually complete the AA degree. If you look at sort of the literature in this field, most of the youth will attend part-time and work maybe on the side, so it does not actually take them 2 years to complete the degree. They take on average up to 6 years to actually complete. So we allow a 6-year time period for them to complete the AA degree, at which time we measure whether they've graduated. And therefore we look at slightly older samples, so 23 to 28. In terms of residency requirements, they for the states to be willing to give them in-state tuition rates, they had to have finished high school in the state. So we look at youth who arrived to the US prior to the age of 16. And in the states that we identify the qualification period, so for most states, it is 3 years. For some states, it's only 1 year. For some states, it's 5. So for the treatment states, we actually require the official residency requirement, but since the control states don't have this law, for the control group to create a similar comparable group of youth, we require for them to be present in the country for 3 years, which is the modal kind of residency requirement for the treated states. And they all had to have actually completed high school. So when we look at the descriptive statistics, so for women, about 56% of women live in a state that offers in-state tuition. About 4.5% of women live in a state that has a hostile approach to higher education and access to it. And about 22.4% live in a state that also offers access to financial aid. On the right panel, we show the statistics for the Mexico-only sample as well. For men, the story is similar. About 53% has in-state access, 23% access to financial aid, and also just over 4% live in a hostile state.
So could I
Yes.
just ask a clarification question? So for the high school, that's free, obviously, right? So the high school education that they have is free of charge, and then
That's right.
When they get to university, then it could become a different thing. So if they are not offered in-state, then you are basically like treated like an out-of-state or international student. Is that right? And then
That's right.
financial aid, does it kind of, I know it says aid, but I if I remember correctly, it could be like an easy interest rate loan, or is it?
So we can't differentiate whether it's access to loans or grants or both. So it's just you have at least the opportunity to apply and get some help. Whether it's loans or grants, we can't tell. That differs by right, the person and their personal characteristics as well.
Okay, Klaus, I think you have.
Yeah, I'm still, I mean, as a European, I'm still confused how you can be in school but undocumented. And I mean, if you can predict with your data whether somebody is undocumented, any school rector or head can do also. How is this in practice? What happens to people when authorities find out that you're undocumented?
So in terms of attending school, like in some places that don't require this strict like proof of documentation, which we would refer as the hostile policies, right? If you have a license, like just driver's license, you can go in and just sign up and take classes, right? And if you can show that you've been living in the state for 3 years, they will even give you access as a resident of the state to the in-state tuition rate. But if the states decide to kind of be more difficult, they could require proof of actually legal residency and documentation that would make it more difficult.
But schools have no legal responsibility to check whether people are documented.
So I think that might also vary by state.
Okay, but this could influence the whole process. I mean, the kind of uncertainty you have as an undocumented person, family. Yes, I mean, is may affect.
I don't think they have any responsibility to like report you to law enforcement for deportation or anything like that.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thanks.
Teresa?
Yes, just a curiosity, for getting this financial aid, is also do you consider also the high school performance? So is based only on, so to enter to the college, no? To get, like, is also considering the fact that maybe you are finishing your high school with a higher grade respect to not. So is a criteria for access to the financial aid or not?
So your high school performance would affect you being able to get into like competitive colleges and four-year universities. We are looking mostly at access to two-year community colleges, which in the United States, the bar of being able to take classes there is pretty much just passing grades. There is no, they don't have really limits in who they enroll, so it's very easy. You have to have like passing grades from high school and possibly test into some of, or you can test out of subjects, but it's not related that much to academics. Our data do not tell us grades, right? It's kind of a census type survey, the American Community Survey, so we don't have access to their actual performance in high school. Whether they could, what we try to do is we control for mother's education to kind of get at least a little bit at, you know, sort of the potential and their ability, but we don't have a ability to control for that. But in terms of the community college, like anybody can go in, and as long as you graduated high school, you can take classes.
Okay, thank you.
Madeline.
Thanks. Questions. First one, what about early college where they're dual enrolled in high school? And then second one, some of these kids, young adults, will be DACA eligible and some won't. Is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So early college, like for us, if they indicate they've taken a college class, because they have, it's going to show up as yes, I've tried. And they actually, if they do it in early college, they take it as part of high school, right? So it's very subsidized. I think you pay, when my kids took some classes, it was even cheaper, I think, than taking the regular classes in there. So they would have access to it potentially as well. So I'm trying to think which way would it affect our results. So there would be more take up even without the policy, I guess, potentially for these kids, right? And the DACA question, yeah. So likely undocumented youth, right, who arrived young, some of them will be DACA eligible. But they will be subject to the same sort of decrease in cost as the kids who are not DACA eligible, right? Right, like they would still get access to the cheaper tuition as in-state residents as these guys versus not. What the difference, I think, between the DACA kids and the ones that do not qualify is the potential for the job opportunities afterwards. For the kids who are not eligible for DACA, they're still going to have very limited access to the formal labor market afterwards, whereas the DACA kids could actually take that degree and put it to use. Right? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, so and this is, I guess, to the next, hopefully, where you guys can chime in. So it is a policy, as I showed you, that has rolled out over time. So our first hunch was, okay, we can use the new staggered timing estimation methods. But then we sat down and we're like, okay, we can't, because we have the in-state policy that rolled out in a certain time fashion. Then the in-state access to financial aid rolled out at different years, and the hostile policies rolled out at different years. So we were kind of stuck, like we can't actually use any of the Callaway-Santana methods because we have multiple policies being rolled out at different times. So we are still estimating the kind of old standard, I guess, two-way fixed effect model for the policies that are in place at this point. So we control for the in-state rollout, we control for the hostile policies, then we add the interaction of, so no states have financial aid without in-state access. So then we add financial aid that is basically an addition and interaction with the in-state policy. And we control for age at arrival, years since migration, their English ability at this point, as I mentioned, the mother's education, their marital status, whether they live in an urban area. Based on previous literature, we also try to control sort of for the characteristics of the environment around them. So what is the percentage of Mexicans with a college education where they live, right? Is it kind of a higher propensity to maybe higher social pressure to enroll, percentage of whites in college. We do try to capture foreign enclaves, so look at the concentration of foreigners in the area that they live, and also the percentage of co-nationals. We do capture the state unemployment and the social policies as well, and then state and year fixed effects, and we cluster at the state level since it's a state level policy. So the first set of results, we're looking at whether or not you are currently enrolled in college. And as a quick preview of what's coming, it is always the big punchline is the hostile policies. They are the most robust result that we get, that if the environment is hostile, they are less likely to be enrolled in school. And we don't find much on the in-state access. If we look at men, we actually find a positive result for states that offer access to in-state tuition and higher probability of men to be taking a college class. Again, the hostile policies always show up as a negative, but men are actually more likely relative to their similar counterparts in states that do not offer access to be enrolled in college classes. Looking at graduation, we look at women and we find positive results of the policy on their probability of attaining an associate's degree, which was a bit surprising to us because they did not enroll in college at differential rates. Men did. But when you look at men, they don't seem to have a higher probability of completing the degree. So we were a bit puzzled by what's going on, and looked at the labor force outcomes. So for women, we do see that when the policy allows them access to cheaper cost of attending college, they are less likely to be working and they're more likely to be out of the labor force, which actually would be consistent with attending school, right? You're not working and you're out of the labor force. But we did not see kind of differential rates of enrollment. Among men, we don't see any impact on labor force participation, but we do see, again, the reaction to the hostile policies that is really solid. And when we looked at this as kind of, trying to dig deeper by marital status, it turns out that married women actually are much less likely to be taking classes in states that offer the cheaper policy rate, which to us was okay. So if the men are actually giving it a shot, if they're trying to take a class, the married women are sort of stepping out of the picture and allowing them to do so potentially. So we saw a drop for married women in attendance, but still, we don't see big changes However, we see graduation outcomes for men. We see college enrollment among the married men, again, going up, right? So some of this intra-household bargaining, the women step back, the men, now that it's cheaper, they try to take a class. And I think that to us, it sort of explained the puzzle that while women are not differentially likely to take a class, so whether you're in a state that has cheaper tuition or more expensive tuition, women still try to take a class. What does seem to matter is whether they finish the degree. So when you have access to the cheaper tuition, they actually persist and continue attending school and finish the degree. Whereas in states that they do not have access to the cheaper tuition, they do try to take the classes, but they don't persist and they don't finish. That seems to be the story kind of suggested by the data to us. Gabriela?
Yes, I wonder if you looked into the availability of daycare for children in the case of married women, because that could be a factor.
So we don't have measures of daycare. I think we could look at whether they live maybe in a multi-generational household, like whether they have a grandma. Yeah, so these are, I mean, they're young, right? 18 to 22. We won't be able to capture, I guess, daycare availability from the ACS data, but we could look at multi-generational household. Thank you. Okay, so the associate's degree, again, by marital status, we do see that women, and it is the single women who end up graduating and getting the AA degree more likely. For married women here, it appears that the access to financial aid is important, more than just having the cheaper in-state tuition as well. And again, hostile policies do tend to be pretty solid across the board. So on the labor force, we do see the pattern that I showed you for women in general. For the single women, they are staying in school, not working, and less likely to be employed and more likely to be out of the labor force. For men, again, no significant change in labor force participation. So they do try to take the class, but don't really stick with it. We do try to estimate the event studies to at least get around some of the biases of the two-way fixed effects. So I will show you, we're estimating them for the hostile policies and for the in-state tuition. So on the left, the column is for hostile policies. So this is women, and the bottom panels are for the sample restricted only to Mexico. So for hostile policies on current enrollment, you see at least a suggestive drop in enrollment. We don't see much for the in-state policies. If you look at ever enrolled, a very similar pattern. It's noisy for women. Hostile policies for graduation, again, they seem to be at least suggestive of a drop, but we do see there at least a bit of a jump on the graduation for the sample focused on Mexico. If we look at men, pretty much zero on the hostile policies, not much there, but we do see that big jump for in-state tuition policy. So they do try to give it a shot and take a class. Ever enrolled, so this is just, have you ever taken a class? Similar pattern. And nothing really on graduation. Slight increase in the event study that we didn't find in the two-way fixed effects. I guess here there's a little bit for men as well. So the next attempt for us to kind of, hone in on the estimation is we decided to try to focus our sample to just the states that implemented the in-state tuition policy in year 2013. So that we're not actually dealing with a staggered rollout. So we're excluding all the states that implemented the policy in different years and only focusing on states that adopted the policy in 2013, and then leaving the control states that never adopted the policy as the control group. So it becomes a simple difference in difference. And we then implement the standard in-state policy, post-period, and the interaction. And look at 2013.
So could I just ask, did any state go back to like from offering to hostile? Did so if a state said agreed that we'll give in-state and then tuition and then kind of change the policy a few years later to hostile?
I think there was one state that sort of flipped, but otherwise states just kind of stay. And we exclude the states that I think it was Oklahoma and Wisconsin that for a brief period went one way or another. Okay. So we tested with kind of excluding them. It doesn't change the results, but most states, once they adopt it, they stay with it. Okay. Does that explain it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So when we look at this simple kind of difference in differences, we do find a little bit of the positive effect on the in-state time post for women of ever having taken a class, and also women in Mexico. And there is the sort of positive interaction of the in-state and financial aid as well. For men, a little bit again on the in-state financial aid, but nothing on the post that we would have expected. On the labor force, nothing significant for women overall, and for men as well, which is what we were finding there, except for the single women in the previous two-way fixed effects estimation. We do try to estimate the same model for the native population in the US because they should not have been affected by the policy. So we run the same two-way fixed effect estimation and they do all come out as zeros. So natives are not differentially attending college in states that offer in-state tuition. They're not graduating in differential rates either. So overall, to summarize, while we find no big response for women to the in-state tuition access, men seem to be more likely to attend college and take a class. However, we do find that the persistence of taking classes seems to be paying off at this cheaper in-state tuition rate for women, and they're more likely to complete the associate's degree, and that is consistent with their labor market participation. So implications for us, we reading all the previous literature, I think the message was, yes, there seem to be some higher enrollments, but for us, the question was, well, all of these states, so there was a large number of states that have been implementing these policies to increase access to in-state tuition and cheaper college, yet these students still can't have access to the formal labor market. So, right, if we're putting this much effort in designing and implementing policies, like why are we stopping just at tuition? That something more needs to be done. So for us, the weaker findings, I guess, were not surprising, because if you can't get access to the formal labor market, why even bother investing in college, right? That it's kind of a package. But it does seem to have some effect. And they, for this population, they generally can get a tax ID, so they can have a job as a subcontractor in some states. So you can still see them perhaps using the degree, but the access to the market is definitely limited. But as we're trying to figure out how to kind of package the DACA mix in there too, Madeline, to your question, because those kids will have access to the labor market. So we would expect at least that population to have a higher uptake of the cheaper tuition rate as well. But that is it. So I'm happy to take questions, comments, suggestions. We would really appreciate that at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. Questions? Thank you, Eva. Other questions? So just to kind of start while people are thinking, in terms of kind of strategy, do you see migrants coming in, and do they have knowledge that some states are hostile and so they move to the friendly states?
So that is on my to-do list as I finish final exams next week, is to actually regress the share of undocumented in each state on the policy adoption to see if there's any movement and change in composition in the states. The literature doesn't show that they move so much for, few $100 of a tuition change, but we are going to test that. So that is one thing that's on my list to try to make sure that there is no movement of people.
Okay, I have a kind of related question, but I'll let Sarah ask her question first.
Hi, thank you for this. That was really interesting. So I have one question and one maybe comment question. The first one, Sarah, I missed your first slide. So in terms of the gender effects, I was just curious because, college enrollment rates are so much higher among women than men, at least native born, as we all are seeing in our own institutions. If that looks similar across immigrant groups, so just some of the framing around why you might think there would be gendered effects would, I think, be helpful and interesting. And then the other partners in school. So if this group started to take a class, met a partner, got married, and so that's why they're not continuing. If the inner household bargaining is there's enough money for one of us to continue studying, and so there's a choice. If I don't remember if the ACS has information about how long you've been married, so you could kind of tease out I know you can't figure out if somebody met their spouse, but that that they might not have been entering college.
So the year of marriage is definitely there, starting in 2008. I don't know if it's in the early data prior to 2008, because the marital history and these came a little later, but we can check that. Thank you.
Madeline?
Was really interesting, I think. I know very little about community colleges and associate's degrees. And so I'm curious, whether there's any way to say something about in the paper, why people, you probably do this, why people are going to community college, and whether that can shed light on some of the things you're seeing. And in particular, I'm thinking on the gender difference, that it may be related to being some kind of healthcare worker, and that maybe the young women are doing it to become, I don't know, LPNs, RNs. I'm not sure that there's some associate's degree that you need. And so maybe looking at occupations that they're doing as well might give some additional insight into what's going on.
So I'm not sure if they're in school or looking at final occupations. Yeah, I can see it. So why do people, so I went to a community college. So when I came to the US, I had no idea how things worked. I, worked at a doctor's office during the day, in the bar at night, and I wanted to go to school, and somebody told me this is way cheaper and it's the same thing. So that's what I did. Now I know it's not the same thing. It was way cheaper. But at the same time, right, there you don't really have grants or the financial assistance as much as in other places. So I think it's partially information access, but it is definitely the cost that I think drives. And if you're looking at the undocumented, most of them, come from families with low educational attainment, period. So I think that's sort of the natural, more likely step for them than a 4-year degree, because they're also much more flexible in part-time attendance. There's no expectations with most of the community colleges that you're going to be taking classes full time. I had classes, mostly evenings and Saturdays, even Sundays, for, in-class participation and stuff. So they're very much geared toward people who have other things to do, which we felt is more of a, so we can't actually tell whether they're in a 4-year college or a 2-year college, but just as one of the outcomes that we're looking at the graduation, we are looking at whether you got the 2-year degree. I guess we could, there's no reason why we couldn't try to check whether there's any differential in getting a bachelor's We just thought that might be a little too much for this population, but we could check that too. No ideas on the estimations. Would you guys buy our two-way fixed effects, or even like that simple difference in difference, or we're trying to see whether this is going to hold up these days, I guess. Teresa?
Yes, just to come back to your diff in diff, I'm just wondering, because you say that you are comparing those that applied this financial aid in 2013, right, against those who didn't ever.
So yeah, so we take all the states who adopted the in-state tuition policy in 2013, and then kick out all the other states that had treatment at different years. We just exclude them and only keep the states who never adopted any other policies.
Yeah, I don't know. I would just look at whether the sample that adopted in 2013 are different or not from those who adopted. So just to check whether some trend or everything is kind of, because you need to be sure that you are not selecting a sample and your result will hold anyway. So just to even some descriptive statistics which are saying to you that you will that there is no specific reason why it was adopted in 2013 in those states and in a different time. It was a different time period for others. So this argument will make you more sure that your diff in diff hold, and you are not selecting a specific sample.
Yeah, so we chose it really just because there was a group of states, so it felt like we can actually try to have a clean difference in difference, right, and avoid the staggered timing, to more kind of convince that the results are not crazy and changing one way or another. It also we've gotten questions before about what about California and Texas, right? And this clean, or I call it a clean or simple difference in difference, actually doesn't have either one of them in there. So the results are not being driven just by one of them or another. So we felt like it was helpful in other things, but I think you're right. It would be nice to show that overall they're not dramatically different.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
I kind of have a related question, which is, in terms of the percentage of undocumented immigrants in states, there must be quite a wild kind of differences in terms of, and I'm just thinking hostile might be because there are too many undocumented, and that has an impact on college enrollment versus those, and that kind of goes towards that selection kind of story a little bit.
So that is, I have two things on my list. One is the first one you mentioned. Is there a change in the sort of proportion of the population in the states around the policy adoption? And then also looking at whether the number of undocumented actually predicts the adoption in the first place. So we're going to test whether it is kind of, I guess, predictive in that sense as well.
Okay. Yeah. And that could also be related to kind of the employment opportunities. I don't know if, that's another, so like within the state, the private sector kind of setup or industrial composition could explain that the enrollment matters more in some cases versus the others.
Yeah, so we're hoping that at least controlling for the unemployment rate in the state is helpful. We are I don't think, or I hope it's not going to make a big difference. We're also just coding in, adding control for the labor force participation rate in the labor force equations as well, just to add a little bit of robustness to it. So I'm hoping that wouldn't make a big effect, but I think in terms of the employment opportunities, at least that should capture some of the big state environment.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Can I
Yeah,
ask,
yeah.
just a curiosity, but did you check whether there is a different participation in college among not immigrants? So among the states, there is a difference in enrollment by state, and this can can affect also the immigrants' participation.
That's right. That's right. So we have two controls in the estimation. One is for the percentage of whites, so who enroll in college from the area you live in, and percentage of Mexicans who enroll in college. So to give you kind of overall propensity to go to school among mostly the natives, and then among the Mexican population as well. Because right, if like nobody goes to college around you, you're not going to go either. But if it's more accepted, you're going to. So we have those controls computed for the PUMA of residents.
Okay, but there is difference between natives gender, like boys and girls, or is consistent, just because you could make a comparison between the immigrants group. So if this is consistent.
Yeah, so we have them just calculated as just overall percentage, because that's what the literature has done. We haven't thought about doing them separately by gender. I guess we can check whether they differ, and there's no reason why we couldn't make them gender specific as well.
Given that your paper is, you wanted to underline these gender differences, so I'm just wondering whether even in within the natives population there is a gender difference or not, or is something really specific of immigrants.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, anything else? Going once, going twice? Great, thank you so much, Eva. That was a great presentation.
I really
very interesting
appreciate
paper.
you guys taking the time, and thank you for the suggestions.